Hello, we've got a cool new article in the latest edition of White Dwarf, and I'm going to have a quick flick through and let you know the 3 key points that I've taken away from this. So here we have the latest edition of White Dwarf. It's issue 480 and this is September 2022. As always, it is chock full of content, but today I'm specifically going to focus on the Warcry stuff because that's what I really like. So as I've said in the introduction to this video, I don't know how that got there. Well, hey. As I said in the intro to this video, I'm going to share with you 3 key things that I've taken from this article, and you can decide if you want to pick up this issue of White Dwarf and read some more. So the first thing, and this is the most simple, but kind of actually the most exciting to me, weirdly enough, it's that this is a column. This is the first of many articles that we're going to be getting in White Dwarf, and it's fantastic to know that we're going to get a series of content. This is particularly exciting when you consider that they've covered blimmin' loads in this article. So for a launch, it could be considered a little bit disappointing that we're only getting this shortish article and there's sort of nothing else. There's no modelling stuff, there's no extra rules, there's nothing at the moment. But they cover a lot in this article. As an introduction, it's really interesting. They cover the work that's gone on behind it in developing this new edition, and they do go on to touch on the sort of campaign approach and then in detail talk about how they redid the stats for everything in the chunky compendium, and that information is also available for free as PDFs. That on its own makes the fact that these are going to be additional articles really interesting because they've covered a lot already. If you look at Kill Team as a really close approximate to this game being the 40k skirmish game, for which Warcry is the Age of Sigmar skirmish game, I'm hopeful that we're going to be seeing new stuff to do with Warcry in these articles, which will then potentially, much like for Kill Team, then go into a book at the end of the year. Now for Warcry, traditionally that's been a Tome of Champions book, which for the first edition always gave us some interesting new stuff to do. So finally on this point, I do wonder if we'll maybe see the Bladeborn fighters. This is something that people are shouting about online. We want to be able to use our Warhammer Underworlds models in this game. Interestingly enough, Dave Sanders, who designs Warhammer Underworlds, is the co-writer of the rules in this edition of Warcry. It's got to be on his mind. Right, number 2, my second point, they have been listening to you, or they've been listening to us. They've been listening to the community, so a real positive here again. But often when a new edition comes along, it's rebuilt from the ground up. We've seen this repeatedly for Age of Sigmar, for Warhammer 40k, and for Kill Team, which had drastic changes to the way it worked. Now, the community was slightly nervous for Warcry because we actually generally felt, aside from maybe a little bit of balancing, that the game worked really well. And this is exactly what they touch upon here. So this article is from Sam Pearson and Dave Sanders. And they do go on to say that the rules for Warcry are quick to pick up, and we've had feedback from people to say that Warcry was the game they used to introduce family and friends to the hobby. They go on to specify and negate one of the fears that people had, that reactions would really slow down the game, and it's not really been an issue in the games that I play, but you know, just to say I am a bit more of a narrative player, so a little bit more casual than the competitive scene. However, they do address this in their considerations. They say, for every new addition to the rules, we have streamlined or reduced the complexity elsewhere to ensure the game is even easier to get into than before. Going on to note that the rules for allies, monsters and thralls have been simplified and introduced into the core rules, as well as the streamlined rules for battle groups. And the battle groups one is one that I always kind of forgot, or I'd have an odd number and I'd have to have a little maths moment where I was like, right, how much do I have to round up the shield to? So for people that are a bit less familiar with Warcry, you chuck your warband into 3 distinct groups, which are then deployed in set places when you draw your cards to find out where you're starting in the game. And historically, you could have any number in 2 of the groups, but you'd have to have at least a third or more in one group, the shield. So when you had like 13 models and things, sometimes it was just a moment to go, right, okay, yeah. I mean, for me anyway, I don't have a maths brain. So one final thing to raise on this particular point, I think we're really lucky to have Sam Pearson back. So Sam Pearson was the chap who designed Warcry in the first place. And they covered this in an article in White Dwarf back in November 2019. And it was an article introduced by Jervis Johnson, who came up with the original concept for Warcry, with inspiration dating back to his teenage years of loving the game Yahtzee.
Yahtzee, that dice-rolling strategy game you play like cards.
So Jervis kind of plonked down this concept for a game which was then going to be worked up more by somebody else, and he introduced the ability and initiative dice from his inspiration from Yahtzee, and also the kind of the idea of how the campaign might work in the game. This was then passed to Sam Pearson, who then worked up Warcry as we know it. Also great to see Dave Sanders join the team, and he is the Warhammer Underworlds games rule writer, I imagine amongst some other things. And interestingly enough, and this is where point 3 comes into it, he talks specifically about his work aligning the data and stats of the fighters for the compendium. So interesting to see that Dave and Sam have worked on this together, and worth noting that Warhammer Underworlds is a much tighter and kind of competitive game, so it's cool to have this amount of attention going into Warcry and the stats of the fighters. So my third point is they actually go into quite a lot of detail here as to the rationale for how they've made these changes to fighters. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of information here, there's quite a lot of changes with the stats. So I'm just going to whip through these in a little bit of detail. You can see what you think. So Dave notes that this edition presented them with an opportunity to go further, to going back to the drawing board and rejigging things. So prior to this in the article, they do cover lots of the information, kind of introducing version 2.0 and talking about how the campaigns work. I've touched upon this on my previous Warcry review video, and there's lots online about how this works. But if you're interested in this, feel free to pick up this edition of White Dwarf. So at this point, when we're talking about the statistics, Dave takes over from Sam, chats about how Warcry's grown considerably from its beginnings, where it catered for a small number of warbands. The growth happened very organically, and they do note that it kind of suffered from a bit of a bloat. And whilst they did take steps to address these issues in Tome of Champions 2021, they took the new edition as an opportunity to go even further. So as well as introducing the reaction mechanics to 40 or so factions, they decided to take an opportunity to kind of tweak things here or there. And actually what happened was they made these iterative changes and then found that actually they had to go back again and again to kind of just rejig things and rework them from the ground up, which marks these really substantial changes we're seeing in the Warcry Compendium, but also in the free PDFs which are available to download, which actually do cover the same content. I've provided a link in the description to my website, which just signposts you to all the PDFs that are available and lets you know which warband's available in which part. So they know this is a really lengthy process, and I really think it's paid off. I mean, the new stats and everything look brilliant. There are a couple of rune marks here and there missing from the book, but we haven't seen the errata yet, so I'm expecting these to be picked up there. So the first key change is that they have made bosses smaller. They talk about the Vindictor Primes and the Gut Ripper bosses of Age of Sigmar, who would previously have around 10 wounds or more than the rank and file equivalents. They've made the change to drop these down to 5 wounds. In addition, the smallest fighters now have even lower wounds characteristics, as the developers' understanding of resilience in the game has changed. They've made these changes to help differentiate between fighters towards the higher end of the scale, and to make it easier for you to build a larger warband. So alongside a change that we've seen in the core rules, melee weapons are now anything under 3 inches in range. When reviewing the profiles, they did note that some weapons that were kind of obviously a melee weapon, such as a flail, actually had 4-inch range, and they've rejigged these to make sure there's consistency across the board. And this is really helpful if you're playing a game, so you can look across the board, you can say, right, that person's got a flail, they can't hit me here, I'm 4 inches away, and you'll no longer be surprised by that. They note how cavalry have changed in Warcry. Now this is something that me and my narrative brain, or certainly my Mordheim influenced brain, which always pictures these skirmish games as being in quite busy enclosed environments, and I didn't quite see cavalry working for me. But what they have done is they've made them a little bit more viable. So if you have a fighter that's got the mount rune mark, they get a bonus to the oomph to their attacks, just to demonstrate, you know, they're going to be punching and hitting harder. And in the core rules, we can see that they can actually run upstairs and things like that in this game, which they couldn't do previously. They've adjusted the points values to account a little bit more for the abilities, and they've rejigged the abilities so that they're a bit more representative of what a double, a triple, and a quad are worth in the game. And then they go on to mention the points changes, which they have completely reworked from the ground up. Often as important, if not more than the stats. No, as important, because they wouldn't work without the stats, but you know what I mean. If something's completely undercosted, then you swarm the board with 20 spider swarms, and it's nuts, and they're on paper maybe not that great, but actually in the game, they're taking down people left, right, and centre, and it doesn't quite work. One of the key things that they've changed the valuing of is how tough fighters are. So this is something I think previously I felt they overvalued in the points. Again, as an Iron Golem fan, they weren't especially competitive in the last version. So they do note that they've had some fighters with low toughness actually increase in points, where some fighters with higher toughness have decreased, based on the amount of effort and the attack actions it should take to get rid of them from the board. Similarly, and on the other end of the spectrum, they've looked at how lethal a fighter is, taking into account the range characteristics of their weapons and move characteristics to determine their threat range. They've looked at average damage dealt versus different toughness characteristics and looked at the swinginess of a weapon. So they've really considered everything that the community's kind of been chatting about and how these fighters work. It's going to be interesting to see how this works against particularly fast warbands like Skaven, who are a bloody nightmare to play against. Well, for me, as an Iron Golem player with my little dwarf sat in the middle just doing bugger all because he can't get into the fight. I'm looking forward to playing more games and see how this goes. They also do touch on wizards in Age of Sigmar changing a little bit, coming down to much lower points to make them a bit more viable with their short-ranged spell attack, which does retain similar stats, but is now cheaper. So highly mobile flying fighters have had their points adjusted considerably. Aether Wings are no longer cheap chaff at 65, they are 115 points. And yeah, you know, I like to throw lots of Furies into my Iron Golem warband just to make up for that myself. So because they've made these adjustments, it has changed the way that many of the core First Edition Warcry Warbands worked, with many of them weighing in at substantially less than 1,000 points. They've sort of gone and say this didn't seem right to them, so they've beefed up the warbands so they now come in at 950 to 1,000 points each, however you've assembled them. So understandably for the Iron Golems who didn't particularly perform well in the old version, now they've rejigged it, they are coming in less and they've had to beef them up. So this has happened across all the original Warcry Warbands, and they describe them as now functioning like the champions they are and are worthy exemplars of a Warcry Warband. Now, in the original lore, they were cultists and they were almost aspiring champions of chaos, so they weren't really supposed to be that great or be able to stand toe-to-toe with something that would actually be forming part of an army in Age of Sigmar, where they are more for the most part, the sort of more elite warriors, certainly in the Slaves to Darkness. Now, making them beefier, I actually quite like the idea that they were pretty successful in fighting their way to gain Archaean's attention over the last 3 years of Warcry, and now they are coming out the other end, they are beefier and they're marching into Ghur to try and nick a load of crazy lizard magical technology from the ruins of Talaxis to go their own way or go back to Archaean and say, hey, look at this, look what I've done. Finally, they touch on reactions, which have been tailored to the playstyle and background of the factions to give new tactical options in your battle. There's a lot of coverage of reactions on YouTube. They were one of the most exciting and publicised parts of the new edition of Warcry, and I've covered them in my review video if you want to go and find them. But yeah, I love them as a mechanic personally. I don't think they slow down my games too much at all, and I like the variability they bring. Plus the tactical options when you're getting absolutely minced and you just want to jab somebody before they kill you. Well, and that's that for this article. We do have some fab pictures of Warhammer Underworlds models, and again, I'm hoping that they turn up in Warcry soon. And I'll be back with some more Warcry content on this channel. If you've enjoyed this video and you like the cut and the jib, then please feel free to like and subscribe, as the post-it suggests. I mean, this is official, look, it's on a post-it. And for people that are subscribing, I am intending to swerve my attention back to Warcry, as it looks like it's going to be an exciting year. So cheers for watching, and let me know what you think in the comments. I'm excited to see what's coming next. I'm excited for the next expansions, and yeah, cool. Thanks for watching. Cheers.